dire wave.
Three.
Our anthropology is not derived by human psychology or, empirical data.
All right. How are you?
Let me get my volume here. Let's see, my volume's turned off.
We are live, so
Excellent.
don't say crazy things.
That's right. That's right. When are we going live, by the way? These goofballs out there.
Yeah, so welcome. We have with us the esteemed Dr. Steve Turley. We had a great conversation the other day on my channel, on his channel. So I'm really honored to have him over here on my channel. And I know you guys are going to be ready for this one, hyped up for this one. This is going to be a great conversation. He is, of course, one of the best, if not the best, YouTube geopolitical analyst that's out there putting down the heat on the globalist establishment, giving us really excellent, deep, red-pilled beige takes. So, Dr. Steve, welcome to my channel.
Oh, Jay, it's an honor. It's an absolute honor. Like I said, I hung out with you on Christmas, and you didn't even know it, right? I was sick with COVID on Christmas Day, and I just did a whole Jay Dyer marathon, and I gotta tell you, being sick sucked, but hanging out with you and your channel was so enriching, and I love what you do. I think.
Well, we'll have to get you sick more often and make sure that you're up to speed on all of the crazy stuff that we talk about on my channel. All right, so if you would just briefly give us an introduction to you. I know a lot of my audience will be familiar with you, but some of us won't be. So tell us about you and the work that you do. Then we'll get into the hot news that's going on. A lot of stuff going on, especially with economics and banks and all that. And you're going to be able to tell us how that all ties into everything. So tell us about you and your background.
Well, I spent a number of years in academia and classical education in university. So I'm an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and author, as the bio would say. And so I've written over 20 books on a variety of subjects, from theology all the way to nationalism and politics, to beauty and aesthetics and music. My first degree was in classical guitar. That's where I met my wife. So I like to say I went where the money is. I got degrees in music and theology, that kind of thing. So,
that's awesome.
Currently, for the last couple of years, since 2016, I've been the host of the Dr. Steve Turley YouTube channel. And we just hit a milestone back in November. We hit over 1 million subscribers.
Yeah, amazing. Congratulations on that.
Oh, thanks, man. Thanks. And right back at you. They hitting the 100,000. I remember that's like, if anything, the crazy thing is that 100,000 was like the golden.
That's the hard one to hit. I mean, it's really hard to get from, below 100 up to 100. And then it seems like, ever since being past 100, we've got a little bit of a quicker growth spurt, but that's also because of, being on with you, being on Tim Cass, being on Sean Atwood, all these, bigger channels has really helped. So thank you so much for, highlighting my work. And,
absolutely.
So let's get into, what you and I talked about was a lot of the ideological trek, I guess, from the time of the Enlightenment up until today and where we are, philosophically speaking. What do you think? What's your general overlay of the Anglo-American establishment? Are you familiar with like Dr. Quigley's works, and what's your take on all that reading that that he has of let's start with maybe the Heartland theory, Rimland theory, and how that pertains to Russia? Do you agree with that analysis that those old Halford Mackinder, Lord Mackinder, British imperial theorists had? That is Washington still stuck in this kind of older ideology, or what do you think's going on with that?
You're talking about sort of Atlanticist ideology, yeah. Definitely. Well, it's funny because they'll take it all the way to the ancient world, the Greeks, and so on and so forth. But I think so. I mean, DC being in effect a coastal city, as is New York or LA or San Francisco, there is something to that. But I do think we're going through a massive paradigm shift, and I do mean it in the Kuhnian sense. If you go back to Thomas Kuhn's Structured Scientific Revolution, he sees a 5-step process to paradigm shifts. And it's very helpful, I find. I find it a very helpful meta frame to kind of organize things. And so, for example, very much like what you're bringing up, the first thing Kuhn would talk about first step in a paradigm shift is the anomaly. Every paradigm, paradigm is basically just a worldview, but every paradigm has an anomaly to it, or has anomalies to it. We view the world, no matter how we view the world, because we're limited, because we're finite. There's always going to be things we can't explain, like teenagers, right? So there's going to be anomalies, right? They're cute and cuddly as kids, and then they hit adolescence, and suddenly they don't make sense. And our paradigm generally ignores anomalies. We're doing a lot of that. Think of MSNBC or CNN, how much they ignore. But at some point, if those anomalies accumulates, a second thing happens, and that is we go through a crisis. That paradigm, that reigning paradigm of understanding the world, ends up suffering from a crisis of confidence and trust, because people don't think it can explain reality very well. So our teenager, say, going back to that analogy, is getting really out of control. So what does my wife do? Well, she starts talking to other parents. She starts reading books. She goes to our priest. She gets some Christian counseling. She does, and then, what she's doing is a very natural, organic process. She's looking for a new paradigm to better understand what the old paradigm can't. And lo and behold, it happens. Suddenly, everything about our teenager makes sense. So she's gone through a paradigm shift. That's that third step. So you have that anomaly, you have a crisis, you have the shift itself, but then there's the problem, a huge problem. And that is, we'll make my wife the good guy here. My wife found the new paradigm, but I didn't. Right. So I can't understand our teenager. We're getting more and more alienated. And then my wife and I start clashing over what to do with our teenager. And Kuhn called that incommensurable paradigms. The old and the new paradigm are incommensurate. They're incompatible precisely because one can understand the anomaly that the other one can't. And that's the clash, I would argue, that we're experiencing, not just here in the United States, between, say, the people in the permanent political class, the coastal elites in our heartland, but at the wider level, we're experiencing it in the West. We're experiencing it as a globe, as a world.
Yeah, and I want to ask, do you see it as kind of a situation where that older paradigm of the post-Enlightenment world of progress, of liberalism, is that kind of breaking down because it eventually had these atheistic, materialistic presuppositions that kind of led to the nihilism that we're seeing out there today? And is that what is the catalyst for people seeking a more grounded paradigm, a paradigm grounded in history, tradition, authenticity? And is that why you think people are looking for things like orthodoxy, traditional religious values?
I think so. Yeah, Jay, you said that perfectly. I do. I think so. I think the anomalies within modernity itself, and there's so many, it's where to even begin. I mean, but you got it perfectly. The inherent nihilism in there, or just something as simple as the fact of sub-replacement fertility levels, right? You start adopting liberal lifestyle values, and guess what? Liberal lifestyle values necessitate the freedom not to reproduce. Well, you cannot not reproduce yourself and then expect your worldview to continue, all the while these so-called far-right crazies over here are having more kids than ever, particularly because they're not dying off. So absolutely. And there's all kinds of ways. There scholars are talking about just how secularism is rooted in doubt and skepticism. This is the Cartesian way of understanding the world. How do I know I exist? How do I know I have a body? How do I know there's an external world? And then somehow through, well, he did it rationally, but it gets developed empirically. And I know you've covered this extensively, but it gets, and you get into Kant and so forth. And it's the notion that scientific rationalism is able to dispel the doubt. If you subject something to a hypothesis, testing, and then some kind of verifying or falsifying conclusion, then you can dispel doubt and you can know for sure that whatever it is exists. But as scholars have pointed out, if your worldview is rooted in doubt, it doesn't take a genius to figure out eventually people are going to start doubting that worldview. And that to me is exactly what postmodernity is.
Absolutely.
It just takes the doubt and the skepticism and the nihilism inherent in modernity and starts applying it to modernity itself. And the good news, to finish off that sort of like that fifth point, is that according to Kuhn, the new paradigm always wins out because the old one never overcomes the crisis in confidence. So it eventually withers away and dies off, or at least is relativized to something far more vibrant. So yeah, that's exactly what I think is going on at a domestic level, at the level of the West, with the rise of the populist and nationalist movements, particularly in Europe, and then and the worldwide level, and the rise of civilization states in Russia and China and India.
Yeah, it seems like the commonality that we might find there is that the Western ideas feel the internal impetus to extend their dogmatic tolerance and their sort of dogmatic leveling project. Because what it does is it quite literally levels the civilizations that it comes into contact with, because it has its own sort of inherent dark logic within it. And it's not any fault of the people per se. It's not the individuals in the West, but when we get to this point where the West is run by a lot of corrupt oligarchs, they then are under kind of a dark, I think, spiritual impetus to push and to try to force this on other cultures. And even if those cultures aren't completely or fully Christian or as spiritual as we'd like to see them be, they at least kind of have an inherent ability, I guess you say, to notice that this importation of these ideas are completely destructive. And it doesn't take a PhD, not talking about you, but I mean, it doesn't require a lot of intelligence to figure out that, hey, if we adopt a sterility worldview, if we adopt an antinatalist worldview, which is where that sterility worldview leads, it leads from, well, you don't have to have kids, to, no, actually you shouldn't have kids and you're a bad person if you do. That's where we're at now.
The Malthusian.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if I can, and just insert it there, but you got it. Your original question is perfect. There's 80% of the world, we're talking the non-Western world, sees what globalist elites are trying to do as radically Western. That's the fascinating thing with postmodernity. With postmodernity going, breaking up into cult, and postmodernity gets absurd, obviously. But one of the fascinating things of how it works itself out in a sort of multipolarity around the world is that more and more populations wake up to the fact and go, these guys in the WEF, these dolts in DC, these guys in Brussels, this is a thoroughly Western thing that they're trying to impose on us that we don't want anything to do with. So globalism only worked, ironically, if you built this kind of Babel, this transcultural Babel, that was able to kill nationalism, it was able to kill civilizationalism, it was able to kill religion, it was able to kill all these identity distinctives. It's the only way modernity and its project could work. And it looked like it was doing pretty damn well for 300 years. Go to a church in Europe. I mean, it's three people are sitting there with you. I mean, it looked like it was doing pretty well. And now it's crashing down all over the place. And it's largely because we just don't buy the fundamental tenets of modernity anymore. The scientific rationalism, the doubt, the skepticism just ends up eating it all away.
Yeah, I mean, these are really dead-end worldviews, sterile worldviews. And, one thing about postmodernity, which I think we talked about when we had that chat a few weeks ago, was that it's kind of connected to this idea of magical thinking, that you can, socially construct everything, logic, biological realities, right? Mathematics, right? Even the external world is a complete social or mental psychological construct. And that's completely destructive, because it's really that fallen drive, that sort of inherent self-worship drive that we all have as a result of the fall, that we need to be healed from. And the healing exists not just at an individual level, but at a civilizational level as well. And I think that's something that you've been talking about a lot, is that people are looking for this a new approach, a better grounded approach to how to have their nations and their civilizations go into the future. And Western corrupt liberalism cannot, in fact, is a disease. It is not able to project anything into the future except death, decay, and destruction. So what about, and I'm asking you this, I know this question is asked a million times, but I think that you are really a qualified person to expound on this, because you do so many great geopolitical analyses on your channel. The top questions that I get, and I'm just not that savvy at this because it's just not my field. But what do you think about, number one, the character of Trump, and then number two, the character of Putin? And I want your take, because I know you're just so good at this. Because I get asked this all the time, and I'm always saying, let me just defer to somebody that knows better than me. So you're going to be that person I defer to.
I don't know.
So what's your take
Yeah.
on Trump and Putin in the last few years and in the present situation, if you want to get into it? Because you cover this a lot on your channel. So
I do. Yeah. So, so with now, when you ask character of Trump, for example, you're talking about, his character flaws and how that.
No, I mean pros and cons. What about 2024?
Okay, got it. All right, yeah. No, I think Trump was again, he was a paradigm shifter. I mean, he was a game changer in 2016. He was up. What was so fascinating with Trump is he was up against, 15 of the GOP's finest. We're talking, the Marco Rubios, the Ted Cruzes, the Rand Pauls. I mean, he was up against guys who have been, dare I say it, groomed in this sort of globalist way of being the ideal neocon candidate. Rand Paul, not so much, but certainly Rubio. I'd throw Cruz in there and the like, and Jeb Bush, you name it, and Trump, he's the last person to have been groomed, as it were. I mean, he's just this brash, New York billionaire, comes in and just blows them all away. It wasn't even a competition. At the end, it was just him and Cruz, and he blew Cruz away. It wasn't even close. So much so, there's a Helmut. What is his name? Helmut Northpoth. He is Helmut Northpoth. He's a scholar over, I believe, at the University of Stony Brook. And he has what's called the primary model, that predicts elections with extraordinary accuracy. And he predicts it based on the primaries. And he finds that the pattern, since we started primaries back in, I think it was around the time of the Fed, around like 1912 or something like that. We started ever since then, the basic pattern, except in 1960 when an election was stolen, and in 2020, but I can't say, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. but every single election, he found that whoever just rocked it in the primary went on and won the general election. And he gave Trump that year like an 87% chance of beating Hillary Clinton. He gave Trump, by the way, in 2020 at like a 93 or 94% chance of beating Biden, just because he was totally unchallenged in the primary. So the fascinating thing is that Trump was able to do something that no one else could. And then the question is why? And there's a number of reasons, but I think largely because he was hitting on themes that are resonating with the hinterland, the proletariat of our country. He was hitting on themes of trade and national border security, and saying Merry Christmas again, and actually standing up and revering our traditions and our customs and our Christian way of life. Whereas everybody else was talking about, bombing this country, bombing that country, lowering taxes, blah, blah, blah. All of this sort of globalist, dare I say it, liberal, neocon, liberal style language that just doesn't resonate with a postmodern mind, or I prefer even a post-secular mind. And he was saying things that resonated dramatically with them, and he was willing to fight for it. He was willing to say, yeah, maybe I want to. He would get pushed. Well, if you're going to appoint pro-life judges, doesn't that mean you might overturn Roe v. Wade? And he comes out and says, yeah, that definitely means it, and I hope we do. He was never afraid of the media, whereas you always felt Ted Cruz or Rubio or Bush, they were always trying to massage their answers in such a way so as to placate the powers that be. Trump told them to screw off. I'm doing it my way. So he's not perfect, but I think he was the avenger in many respects that so much of rural America in particular, who've been forgotten. I often refer to it as the Brexit vote. It was the American Brexit vote. In the Brexit, you had more people come out and vote for Brexit than any had ever voted for any politician or party in Britain's history. Over 17 million people came out and voted for Brexit. Absolutely astonishing number. And 2 to 3 million of those people did not vote in any previous election. They just in Britain, they just felt like they had nobody to vote for. Nobody was standing up for them. And suddenly Brexit referendum comes, and they go, I can vote for that. It's the same thing with Trump. And that's why we had 200 counties almost in Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and Pennsylvania that have voted Democrat in every single election since Dukakis in 1988. Suddenly switch over and vote for Trump, some by 20 points. Iowa voted for Dukakis in 88. Iowa is now, as I understand, every single representative and senator and their governor and both houses or both chambers of their legislature are thoroughly Republican. They're thoroughly red and populist Republican as well, as is Ohio.
It's weird because, you know, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, maybe even the 60s, you think of the Democrats as the people, the workers, right? The people, the
populist party,
yeah, the populist blue collar people, and then now, you know, that's kind of flipped, and you've got the Democrats who are the you know, the elitist kind of
warmongers,
pseudo technocrat warmonger party, with just the worst ethics, you know, the ethical stance.
You got it, absolutely. So that's Trump, and I think he's clearly the front runner by far for 2024.
So you would say between DeSantis, you would say between DeSantis and Trump, definitely a Trump over DeSantis.
Trump would, at this point, because he just has the heart of the Republican Party right now, which is the rural vote, which is very. I mean, when Youngkin ran in 2021, white women without college degrees voted for him by 80%. We've never seen that before. They tended to vote Democrat, and all of a sudden now they're voting massively Republican. That's the Trump effect that he had. And
now, do you see that Trump effect still there, or do you think that, you know, there's kind of like some of the steam of the memes of 2016 and all that, has that kind of dried up, or do you think that there's still enough energy there that he would be the hands down forerunner?
I do. We'll have to see how it works itself out. But right now, all the polls seem to show it's still he has a commanding lead, like 2016, even actually much more than 2016 in many respects.
Yeah, I don't find DeSantis to be that convincing. You know, I mean.
And we'll have to see. I liked his answer with Ukraine. You probably saw that with Tucker.
Yeah, I mean, he says some good things and he's done some good things. Yeah.
That's the thing. Trump, Dick Morris refers to him as the hybrid candidate. He's tried. You know, we know what he's like. We know when he's under pressure, he doesn't buckle. He pushes right back at the lamestream media in a way that they freak out over. I mean, there's a reason TDS exists. Trump derangement syndrome is real. And there's no DeSantis derangement syndrome. I mean, they'll try. I mean, he'll trigger them, but we haven't seen the media, the gatekeepers, because I see the media as the social imaginary for the globalist world. So the way culture functions for a nation or civilization, the media functions for globalization, because globalization doesn't have a culture. So they provide the imagination that culture, you know, literature, art, architecture, music, poetry, and the like religion most particularly have always created. The media creates that. So when he tears into the media and he starts crushing all things globalist, they literally flip out at him. They think he's Satan incarnate. So, I love that. I mean, no one does it like Trump. And I think right now with Biden dithering, there's a very, very good chance we can win back Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona.
Yeah, so I don't see any. I mean, unless there's a massive FRAUD, I can't see anyone in the Democrat side having any kind of popularity or
You're right,
you know,
right.
gusto to really, you know, get the attention and the following, the cult of personality that's needed. You know, Trump always is going to have that cult of personality power, which is that's the strength of, you know, politics, right? I mean, Obama had this strength of personality, especially with, you know, middle class white women, you know, this kind of stuff. So,
Right.
So now,
you want me to get Putin just real quick?
Yeah. What's your take on that? And then we'll move on to.
So I mean, Alexander Dugin he has a great work, Putin versus Putin. So the first 10 years, 2000 to 2010, He's going to NATO meetings. Okay, one of the most famous speeches was the Munich Security Council, which was a NATO meeting. He's going to NATO meetings. He wants to join NATO. He's actually very globalist in many respects. He thinks a China-Singapore-like model will work for Russia if Russia could get its act together. The traditionalists couldn't stand him. Dugin at one point said he hated Putin in the first part of his tenure, as it were. But he did do something that was very fascinating, and it was starting in 2000. He instituted something called spiritual security, and he recognized that in order for Russia to have any kind of future, they had to have a moral foundation that we had through our sort of, our Puritan theocratic roots. Russia had under the czars and its Orthodox roots, but communism had chipped away so much at. We forget that when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, only 30% of the Russian population claimed to be Russian Orthodox. 70%, 7 in 10 said, no, I'm not. They almost wiped this Orthodox identity off the map for Russia. Today, it's the opposite. Today, it's almost 80% now say they're Russian Orthodox. It's been extraordinary revival. The Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion did a 2012, very extensive study in 2012, fascinating paper that concluded that Russia was indeed going through a bona fide Christian revival. And interestingly enough, they looked at Christian views of politics. Do you think the church should influence politics? The vast majority, 70% or so, said absolutely. So they said, this is amazing. This is even more than Americans in that sense. So he believed that revitalizing the church was necessary for a moral foundation. Totally pragmatic from what we can see. It's not like he was a Billy Graham or Franklin Graham or anything like that. So they instituted something called spiritual security, where all of their national security policies need to take into consideration the moral and spiritual culture of Russia. And that's when he started, it seems, to rethink globalism, because he started to see the adverse effects of globalism, its anti-cultural, anti-religious effects through disembedding, dislodging political, cultural decision-making from the parish level, as it were, and recalibrating it at the elite, transcultural, trans-religious level, and so on. And then all the problems he had with NATO inviting Georgia and Ukraine into their fold after he explicitly told them in 2007, if I recall, you cannot do this. We see this as an existential threat. The movement of NATO towards Russia is going to provoke a response from us, blah, blah, blah. John Mearsheimer talks about that. Even Henry Kissinger was warning against that. And around 2010, 2012, it was when he ran for the third term as president. He started talking about Russia as a civilization state, started using that term in his speeches. And he basically said the West is dead. We can't compromise with them. We can't work together with them. It's their way or the highway. Liberalism is a totalizing system that's going to completely wipe out. It's going to finish what communism started. It's going to wipe out our religious civilizational tradition. The only way that Russia has any future is if we go back to our traditions that gave us 1,000-year civilization. And if we do that, we'll have another 1,000-year civilization. For lack of a better term, he seems to have a very real cultural conversion. And that's when the church and the state literally begin forming a symphonia. That spiritual security really starts working itself up. Churches are being built left and right. They were already doing that, but then all of a sudden now we had St. Nicholas Cathedral, a naval cathedral that's being built, a military cathedral, very famous military cathedral that was just built on one of their bases outside of Moscow. And he began to speak in distinctively Russian neo-Orthodox, not the theology, neo-Orthodox and Orthodox Christian civilizational terms. And there's just no way around it. Say what you want about the guy. Say, I don't like how he runs, blah, blah. I'm sorry. It's irrelevant to the fact that this man, more than I think anyone else, has embodied the spirit of the revitalization of an ancient civilization and an ancient theology of church and state, known as Symphonia, more than anyone else we've seen literally since Tsar Nicholas. And so I have to, I have to tip my hat to the guy. He's absolutely stunning in terms of his foresight and his entire vision of the world. It's not just Russia. He recognizes that the pivot towards the East, the pivot towards China, the pivot towards India, the pivot towards Iran, even the pivot towards Turkey. There's a lot of tension there, but the pivot there, very good relations with Israel, very good relations with Sub-Saharan Africa, very good relations with the whole of the Middle East, very good relations with Venezuela and Cuba and so forth. He recognizes that this is the recalibration of 80% of the world away from the West. And that will ultimately have the power of not only relativizing the West, but with what's going on in Ukraine, it may even have the power of crushing NATO and severing NATO. And so that
would be pretty wild. I mean, and it looks like things are heating up in the sense that NATO seems to be weaker and weaker in this conflict. Even though the media is saying the opposite. Basically,
I was just going to say, no, they're not, Jay. They're stronger than ever. We're more united than ever.
Just go with the opposite of whatever the media is saying, right? If Jim
right, mirror reading. That's right. Yeah.
If Jim Cramer's screaming at you to buy Silvergate
right,
or
sell.
SVB, don't buy it, right? So let's get into the economic issues now, because and I want to remind everybody in the chat, if you want to use the Streamlabs link for the super chats, and you can ask Dr. Steve Turley questions. We'll get to those in the last 10 minutes up here in the towards the end of the hour. And then you can also follow him over at the links. He is linked underneath the super chat link in the show description at Dr. Steve Turley TV or Dr. Steve Turley TV. So use that super chat function there with Streamlabs, and we will get to those here in a little bit. Also, remember to follow him over on the rest of the social medias, and follow me on the Twitter and all those other places as well, and on Rockfin too. So let's get to the economic situation, because I saw some of those posts that you'd kind of done these overview analyses in the last week or so, covering these economic bank collapse failures and all that. It seems like the whole system is like this giant kind of house of cards, and when you pull the nodes out of FTX, which is this big scandalous Democratic Party money laundering funneling operation, then that kind of leads to other things are big scam money laundering. SVB is a big version of this. They're all kind of toppling, but the whole system is actually built on fiat fraud and debt to launder money and to be a scam. And I thought you did some really good analyses kind of pointing that out. What's your take on all that?
Yeah. I mean, for me, the paradigm to help understand what's happening, sort of big picture civilizationally and the like, is this paradigm that I think Jürgen Habermas started referring to in the 70s or 80s, what he called refeudalization. And I think it's actually a little unfair to the Middle Ages. I actually tend to dig the Middle Ages, but he calls the globalist world in which we were living, and he saw it happening. I think he would, just be astonished if he saw it today. I don't even know if he's still alive, but Joel Kotkin of late has been writing a lot about this. He's sort of an old school liberal Democrat who feels like his party has left him because of this process known as refeudalization. The notion is simply that our society is more and more becoming stratified by class, in a manner comparable to the Middle Ages. And what he meant by that is twofold. One, we're seeing extraordinary amount of power culminating in the hands of very, very few. So just 5 years ago, for example, 400 billionaires controlled half of the world's assets. Today, it's 100 billionaires. I mean, it's happening that fast. It's incredible speed. And because we're living in a digital age, so things move incredibly fast. So that's the first thing. And it's not just, as we saw with Barney Frank on the board of Signature Bank and the Obama and Clinton cronies that were sitting on SVB. It's not just the economics, it's the politics. And what people, hopefully, I know your audience will clearly understand this. They're absolutely interconnected. So absolutely. The guy who co-authors Dodd-Frank to regulate banks is sitting on the board of a bank. That's how it works. So he goes and he writes the legislation that banks want him to write, and then he goes and he gets a cushy job a 7-figure job, doing nothing, doing a Hunter Biden,
revolving
charisma.
door, exactly.
Exactly. And that's the revolving door. So bankers become bureaucrats, and bureaucrats become bankers. And so it creates this elite group that has seen their income skyrocket over the last few years, while everyone else, until inflation, everyone else's income was flat. Now it's going down because our money isn't worth anything. So that's the first thing. You've got this tremendous amount of power that's being allocated in the hands of very few. But then the second thing, which is so fascinating, because we saw this with SVB and Signature and the like, the second, and with also Bankman-Fried, and when his fell apart, the second thing is during the Middle Ages, you had, well, again, these secular scholars they'll say you had this religious fundamentalism that was being imposed by this clerical class on the serfs, as it were. Well, today we have a religious fundamentalism, a totalizing system that will not tolerate any dissent. Any dissent, by definition, is profane and therefore needs to be excommunicated, hence cancel culture. And that's, of course, wokeness. And so what you're seeing, and instead of a clerical class, we have a clerisy class, a class of intellectuals, pseudo-intellectuals, university profs, professionals, and particularly the media, the
blue check marks, exactly.
The blue check marks, the credential class, exactly, And so these two forces have combined together to create a top-down tyrannical society where if you end up dissenting, if you end up saying, no, I don't really buy that, there's no discussion with you. You're pushed out. You're kicked out of the land. You're no longer allowed to stay on the Lord's property, as it were. And so I think what we're seeing here, fortunately, is the exposure of this neo-feudal society. And we can't forget that feudalism eventually resulted in this Protestant Reformation, which in many respects was a kind of populist revolt against the magisterium. And so in many respects, I think we're seeing a very similar movement here, where more and more people are just revolting against this refeudalization, saying they don't want to have any part in it whatsoever.
Yeah, it's a great analogy to the feudalism stuff, because a lot of people think that, well, we've been living in this period since the scientific revolution, since the French Revolution, the various revolutionary phases that have come in the last few hundred years, that we're achieving more and more equality and more egalitarian forms of government and so forth, and liberty and whatnot. But right now I'm with one of my good buddies, Frank, over at Frank TV. We're doing a deep dive into Brave New World. This is, I think, my third time going through it. And every time I go through it, every 4 or 5 years, I notice so many new things I never noticed before. And so if we want to understand the end of the revolution, guys, where does the technocratic revolution end? Or the final revolution, as it's called. The final revolution is what Dr. Turley talked about, where we have a new feudalism of these socialist technocrat overlords, a Klaus Schwab type character who basically will decide what you can and can't do, what you can and can't eat, where you can and can't go, on and on and on. And so it's a complete, as Dr. Turley mentioned, feudalistic, it's a refeudalizing type of model. It's even worse because a medieval serf could, go take weeks off throughout the year. He had religious holidays. He had his own land.
Right.
He had it better than what Klaus and company want. And this is a caste system. People forget that. Wait a minute. There's a strict, rigid caste system of this elite oligarch class that's above you. It's not an egalitarian system. And Huxley, who's part of that whole revolution, was saying, well, of course, we're going to impose this upon you, and you can't even understand what we're going to do to you. He says it in the Berkeley lectures. He's like, well, of course we're going to do this, and you can't even recognize it.
And you just look at environmentalism. Environmentalism has become it's become the new religion. It is a cosmic ecology.
How dare you? How
dare you? Now, well, that's the beauty of it, because she embodies the futility of all this. Thank God, right? Thank God. She embodies it. You probably saw she was in Oslo protesting wind farms, right? Greta was protesting green energy on behalf of indigenous Norwegian people, where the government was building wind farms on their property where they husband reindeer, and she bumped into a conflicting political interest within identity politics, and she became an advocate of the human rights of an indigenous group of people, which meant she had to protest against the very green energy she was advocating before.
We should ban the wind, ban wind, ban the wind. I should be in school. I love it when the way she says school.
Yes, the one true thing she said. She should be in school. Yes, yes. The strange pagan maiden that they brought in on there. But you got it. I mean, so you, in many respects, I think that's what COVID was. It's a dress rehearsal for, okay, we have a cosmic virus now.
Right.
And so now the top-down powers get to orchestrate the totality of society. That's what COVID was. If you think COVID through, it was insane. It's the first time that I know of, a first time where everyone was quarantined. I mean, we've always quarantined the sick. We've always set apart people with ailments and contagions, but this is the first time we literally said to everyone, you have to stay in your homes. And if they did that with COVID, they're going to do that with the ecology. And you could see it a mile away.
Absolutely. Climate lockdowns, radical austerity to halt, progress, real development. And that's by design too. In my opinion, I don't know this for sure. It's just my kind of theory on this is that they're kind of intentionally imploding the existing system to help further the new system that they want to bring in. So that right. To me, that explains so much of what's going on. We look at these figures like Biden.
That's part of the refeudalization thesis that Joel Kotkin talks about, because he's an old school liberal. So, it was FDR and so forth. And so what did they all stand for? The continuous ascendance of the middle class. So, your parents didn't go to college, but you got to go to college. Your parents didn't have a car, but you had a car. Your parents had an apartment, but now you have a three bedroom home. You own your own home. It's an ascendant middle class. And what are these elites telling our middle class now? What are they telling them about cars? What are they telling them about gas stoves? What are they telling them about home ownership? What are they telling them about living on farms and so forth? Don't do it. You're not allowed. You will own nothing and you will be happy.
Yeah, and I think it fits in with, let's say I had a little list of things that kind of all go together here. I want to get your take on this. So this notion of banning, and shout out to Ava, who just participated in those protests in the Netherlands, which I think they were successful in calling attention to the attempt to ban.
They had elections yesterday.
Yeah, exactly.
And the BBB party blew everybody else out the water.
Right. And so that calls attention to this fact that this is all kind of an integrated subversive warfare approach on the part of the global elite, because they want to bring in not just the banning of farming, which is your own ability to be off the grid, to have your own, sustainable, real sustainability, not their fake version of sustainability. It's tied into the banning of cars, the banning of meat. You will eat the bugs, you will not eat the meat, no more steaks, right? It ties into freedom of commerce, your ability to have free transactions with whom you want. It ties into the notion of the 15-minute cities where now you're going to live in this little smart grid. You'll be locked down. And this goes back to that, Agenda 21 idea of the Rio Bush Treaty. It's all, like you said, neo-feudalism. ESG is tied into this. This is that top-down corporate control. And then last thing is, of course, the euthanasia and the idea of unaliving yourself, which, eras like governments like Canada are now pushing. All of these things go together because it's a new system that they want to bring in by design.
Yeah, we have to remember technocratic societies by their nature are tyrannical. I mean, that's where they go. I think it was Carl Jung who made that argument back in the 30s, because technology could be good or could be bad, but what it's fundamentally about is control. I get to control the lights by flipping a switch, right? We get to control how we talk to each other by, hitting a button and clicking on a link and all this sort of stuff. It's all about control. But what if you live in a technocracy? What if you live in a society that's held together by technology? Well, you need some kind of elite class of experts, and they're literally called that.
The managerial expert class.
The managerial class, exactly. You need an elite class that controls the technology that controls society, and we're part of society. So inevitably, you get this pyramid structure. You get a refeudalized structure in a technocratic society of total control, and that's what they're doing. That's the WEF in a nutshell.
Exactly. And I want to remind everybody, too, that if you want to support the show, be sure and head on over to the show sponsor, which is chalk.com. That's CHOQ.com. That's the best, most awesomest supplements that you can find on the internet. They're our sponsor. They've been our sponsor now for, I think, going on almost 2 years. And we love chalk.com. I'm a frequent experimenter with all of their products, but I really enjoy the Tonkat Elite, which I showed you here, because that will, via peer-reviewed studies, if you go look at the website at Chalk, it shows you that it actually does boost testosterone. Now, they have a bunch of other toxic masculinity improving products. They will actually up your toxic masculinity points on the toxic masculinity scale, of which I am the official creator of the toxic masculinity scale. So I'm the measure. So I'm up here at the top. So if you want to get closer to my high level toxic masculinity, do so over at chalk.com. They also have the daily, which is great for overall supplementation. They also have the Action 2.0, which is great for boosting your overall energy levels. And they also have Shilajit, which Jamie loves. That's her favorite, that and the Irish Moss, because Shilajit's great for mental focus and clarity. So if you're looking to read, people ask me all the time, how do you focus so much? How do you read so much? I use chalk.com for energy and focus and a lot of espresso. So those are my secrets to reading all the time. And Jamie loves the Shilajit for that focus and clarity. And she also loves the Irish Moss because the ladies, they like to have those hormones balanced out. And of course, Irish Moss is great for that. So because our diets are nutrient deficient, we have supplementation, which helps with that over at CHOQ.com. That's chalk.com. Use the promo code J50 to get 50% off any of those products over there, and use the promo code J53LIFE, J53LIFE, to get 53% off all recurring subscriptions. And I think you're going to be happy with what you get. You're going to want them coming in recurring, loads, truckloads, because anybody who gets on Chalk and really spends time checking it out is a big fan of that. And so Dr. Steve Turley is with me, if you guys just turned in or clicked in recently, and we're going to be taking some super chats. So use the Streamlabs function, and you can ask Dr. Turley questions or me. Now, reminder, guys, it has to be questions within, terms of service and all that, so we don't get the channel nuked. So if you ask a crazy question, you won't even get it read. So keep it within those strictures. And one thing I like to do with guests who are eminent scholars like yourself is to ask for book recommendations. So you being a doctor, if you could maybe give us a few texts that you think are really formative or really excellent on history or geopolitics or orthodox geopolitics, or what's some of the texts you would throw out that are really good, including your own books, of course.
That's right. Let me go grab them for you.
Grab your books.
Oh, there's so many. So maybe a nice diet of things. So one book I would recommend to help sort of understand the world, the modern world and the nature of it, is a book by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man. It was a stunning work for me that I encountered years ago, and I taught it in school, read it over and over and over again. And he said something brilliant there. If you want to understand the modern world, is just the brilliant thing he said is, before the rise of the modern age, in what, for lack of a better term, the classical world, the chief end of man, as it were, was to conform his soul to the divine meaning and purpose all around him. And the way you do that is through wisdom and virtue and prayer. But in the modern age, we no longer believed in a world filled with divine meaning and purpose. We just saw nature, meaningless, purposeless nature, because we were only seeing the world through scientific rationalism. So in the modern world, it's not about, the chief end is not to conform my soul to the divine meaning and purpose around me. No, the chief end is to conform meaningless nature to my own desires and my own ambitions. And he recognized that eventually, because that involves science, technology, and the state, it was going to be for the benefit of the very few. He calls them the conditioners. It's a very, very fascinating argument. It starts by saying this is for everybody. Everybody gets to follow their heart and go after their dreams and conform the world to your own desires. But he recognized that the logic of that, the more technological a society like that became, That dream is only for the very, very few at the top, and everybody else is treated like nature, and nature by definition could be manipulated. It's a fascinating argument, and he does it in under 100 pages. There's a lot of Latin and Greek phrases in there, so you may have to stick next to Google and punch it in there, but it's brilliant. It's well worth it. Another book that I loved is a book called Orthodoxy, but it's not my orthodoxy. It's G.K. Chesterton, a good Roman Catholic fellow. And it's a book about the classical conception of wonder and awe. And I'm thinking particularly, I think it's chapter 4 on the ethics of Elfland. And I've shared this with students over and over again. And it's just blown their minds in terms of how different we as secularists tend to relate to the world around us. We tend to be very skeptical, very flippant, whereas the ancient mind tended to be one that's its basic orientation was, well, Plato would call it in the Greek thauvma, wonder and awe. In terms of geopolitics, dang, I'm going to go with a classic here, what's become a classic. And I just think in the end it stood the test of time. It definitely had some issues with it, but it's so good. If you have not read Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, you gotta. It is absolutely wonderful to help you with a paradigm for the world we're living in. I would also recommend a book by a Chinese scholar called, his name is Zhang Weiwei, and Zhang is Zhang, and it's Weiwei. So Zhang Weiwei, and it's called The China Wave, and it's about China as the rise of a civilization state as opposed to a nation state. And he's a scholar. He was educated in the West, and he explains the notion of a civilization state brilliantly. And I think that really helps us. You read that and you recognize there's no future for the dolts in DC and the bullies in Brussels and the demons at Davos. A new world is rising here, and there's nothing that, well, short of nukes, there's nothing they can do to stop it.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for those recommendations. That's it's always great to get wise men's book recommendations. So many people don't do that. They do these interviews and they never try to pull out of the wise man out of his heart his recommend. Solomon talks about that. He says if he says frequent the doorstep of a wise man, pull the secrets of the wisdom out of a wise man's heart. So that's what we try to do here, and I hope you guys appreciate that. Also, along those lines of Abolition of Man, we did the analysis of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, and of course the third one in that Space Trilogy is the most revelatory.
That hideous strength.
Yeah, exactly, which is about the technocracy. So guys, remember to go subscribe to Dr. Turley, and let's go to the super chats here before we let him go as the hour ends. We got, first one is from J Mel, $10. It was nice of Revolver to cite you today. Great material. Yeah, shout out to Revolver News. Appreciate them citing that old article I'd written on feminism many years ago. I written so many articles that I forgot about them, and I just remembered that one the other day because we had done the interview with Rachel, and I reshared it. I want to remind you guys too, if you go to my shop, the website, you can get all of those essays that I wrote many years ago in this big fat 600-page book, essays on theology and philosophy, as well as our other texts. And of course, in the links, I'll put in the show description the link over to Dr. Steve Turley's website, where you can also get his books too. Block Party Vintage, $3. Thanks to both of you. Dugan and Kissinger are using this phrase multipolar world. Do you think they mean the same thing, or does multipolar mean different things between them?
That's a phenomenal question. If you did a Venn diagram, I'd say most of it overlaps. There'll be a little difference there. Obviously, we're seeing that a little bit with China and its conception of Tianqian. So they'll talk about a multipolar world, but they'll mean something slightly different. Tianqian means under heaven, which is China. China's basically the Mount Meru, or in the Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, or Olympus, or Jerusalem. It's the center point of the world. It's very interesting because of the different ways Russia and the United States and China related to globalism. And that's, I think, key. So both the United States and China obviously had a very positive relationship to globalism. The United States being a unipolar power using globalism as its one of its mechanisms. China being, some would say, the force that's taking over. Russia, in many ways, was sidelined by globalism. So Russian theorists like Dugin are very, very negative towards globalism. That's why Dugin resonates with a lot of us when he speaks. We're singing the same tune, kind of thing. So they could talk multipolarity and have some overlap, but there's going to be some differences. For Dugin, no unipolarity whatsoever. It's a totally multipolar, multi-civilizational world of multiple political and economic poles of power. Whereas China and the United States will talk about multipolarity, but they also might say it's a multipolarity that finds its fulfillment in the United States, or it finds its fulfillment in Beijing. So there might be some snuck in unipolarity there as well. So that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and I would add too that in Kissinger's recent book World Order, the last chapter is about technocracy, and he says whoever has the tech will run the world. Lamont,
and that's where AI kicks in too. There's going to be a whole nationalist race for AI. Yeah.
Lamont Stigler, $1. Is there a link between Freemasonry and Hinduism? The degree system in Freemasonry resembles Hindu caste. I think there is overlap just due to the fact that some of the famous, I think T.H. Huxley, these characters, they did have an interest in Hindu thought, and they were Masons. I don't know that there's a one-to-one correspondence, but I do think the caste system and the using that gradation structure as applied to the social order, there is overlap there. Yeah. I'm gonna try to go through these fast. I'm not trying to skip Dr. Turley, but just because we did get several more coming in here towards the end. Alberto Traficante, $3. This is a question for Dr. Turley. In the Trump debate with Hillary, he said he could get along with Putin. He joked about having emails. They're having her emails. Did that become a game changer for the neocons and liberals to defeat Trump at all costs?
It's a great point. Probably. Yeah, I could see that. They hate Russia. They really believe this Ukrainian situation. They really believed. I don't think they believe it anymore. Certainly not the latest article from the Washington Post indicates that with the fall of Bakhmut. But they really believe they could take Russia out. There's two nations that stand in the way of continued unipolarity. It's Russia and China. India is still playing. It's playing both ways, as it were. And if they could contain China and knock out Russia, they think they can have Pax Americana in perpetuity. It's not happening.
Crazy Texan, $25. Politics may be downstream from culture, but it seems that everything downstream is from education, which seems to be co-opted by the left and possibly by influence from China. I don't see how we stop this decline until the hold is broken. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's great. Well, we're going through an educational renaissance. That's the good news. Homeschooling is up 700%, and in parts of the country, and primarily in some of the most secular parts, like the Northeast. I saw it myself. Classical education it started off just about 10 schools in 1994. Today they're hitting 700, and this is all about bringing back truth, goodness, and beauty, and theology in Latin and Greek. So we're going through an educational renaissance, but it's going to take some time. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not education, it's indoctrination right now, and that fits in with the refeudalization and the new fundamentalism.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And part of the reason that we have started the Autonomy University courses with Richard Grove over at Autonomy. So that link is also in the show description. You can purchase my History of Western Philosophy course, which goes from the pre-Socratics all the way up to Nietzsche and postmodernism. So get access to that through that link in the show description if you want a full philosophy course. And for those that did purchase tutoring, that will be tonight. We'll have the second class for this season of tutoring tonight. J Mel, $40. These are my two favorite scholars. Thank you for getting together. Well, thank you so much, J Mel. Yeah. Avery Hawat, $1. I'm becoming a catechumen in the Orthodox Church. Thank you for helping me to leave Roman Catholicism. Hey, great to hear that. And I don't see any more, and we've gone for an hour. Dr. Turley, thank you so much for coming on. It was a great conversation. I think we hit the high points. Anything you want to leave us with before we head out?
I love your work. I think you're amazing. I think you're a treasure.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can't thank you enough for just gracing me some time here. Your audience is amazing. What you're doing is amazing, and you are part of what makes me so optimistic about the future.
Well, hey, ditto, and thank you so much. And